the Larry and Ellen Foster Communications Librarian, and in that role I work closely with the journalism and media studies and advertising majors at Penn State. I also, until very recently, was head of the News and Microforms Library and the newspaper librarian generally in the university libraries. And so in that role, I'm kind of that liaison librarian you were asking about earlier. And over time, I've begun to notice a lot of differences in the kinds of reference questions I'm getting about news content, what kinds of things researchers and faculty wanted for their research projects. And so I've been slowly, through some sabbaticals and whatnot, trying to learn more about how users use news content, and also thinking more about what our role is in all of that. So I guess that's how I've come to be here. What I want to do today is three things. I want to try to place newspapers and news content, and I'll just say right up front that when I say news content, we no longer, as I'll explain a little bit more here, and you know this already, we can no longer just talk about newspapers. So we're talking about the born digital kind of content. And I want to place both of those into a framework of today's research and the kind of research that's being done and the kind of methods that are being used. So we'll talk about some text mining. I want to show you several examples, some very simple examples of new research methods, text mining specifically, and how they're being used with news content. That's going to be my focus. And finally, I want to provide some perspective on why libraries should seek to continue to provide access to yesterday and today's news content and formats. So just generally, I want to ask you to suspend any beliefs or understanding you have about how or whether or if students or anybody's reading news anymore. Because that's what I've come to realize as I've worked in with this kind of content and this question is that whether people are reading newspapers or news or watching it or whatever they're doing it's a very much a different problem and question from whether we're going to be preserving news for news research. The two are related. I can't say that they're not, but they're two different kinds of problems in terms of the library's role. So what I want to do is to talk about newspapers and news content and the kinds of research methods, many of which we wouldn't expect will be used with news content, regardless of whether people are reading the news or not. So this is a graph, and I used it mostly because it shows, it's a graph showing information consumption. And I know that in a general day-to-day basis, some of us feel like news is coming at us from every direction, that we're kind of drowning in news. We can't, it's hard to sort of make heads or tails of what's going on. Sometimes it's coming on our cell phones, it's coming on our computers, it's coming on the TV when we get home, or in the library as you walk through the library, it's everywhere. And I think it seems like it's everywhere, but I think if we look at news more carefully, we'll see that a lot of news is the same news over and over, and that we need to think more carefully about what constitutes news content. So what I want to talk about is the changes that are occurring in news, because the changes that are occurring in news are going to ultimately affect what kinds of research methods we use and what kind of research questions are asked. So I can do this several ways, but I decided to modify my usual list that I would give to a different audience to this kind of idea about what's impacting research methods. So first of all, this very basic thing I've already mentioned, that newspapers it's not newspapers anymore, it's news content. And not only is it news content, but news is now can be defined quite differently. We need to define what news is. And we can define blog postings. If you have a journalist who comes to Penn State and speaks to the journalist students, as we do regularly, they'll almost always talk about how they're also being asked and required as part of their job as journalists to blog, okay, and what that means to them as a profession and their workload. Then additionally, there's the blogs that citizens, you and I, our students, people in general, respond to those blogs, or blogs just hanging out there that people want to comment on. So these are becoming important forms of news as we think about how news is created. So Facebook, Twitter, blogging from all different sources. The role of citizen journalism these days is becoming more and more a part of news content as we see it. So the other thing second thing we have to realize is that most of this content will never be in a print form. And most of what we provide to our students and faculty and researchers is news content that originally was in a news form. It now is taken as a feed into a database aggregator, a LexisNexis or whatever. But most of this other content that I've just described never is in that format and doesn't have any natural pathway to make it available to our students and researchers. And in addition, more and more of this content has much more, even more so than in the past, visual content. So it has many more photos, video, the advertising that's related, all of this, there's just a wealth of visual content that doesn't come with the textual elements, not only the fact that it's not text anymore, or print anymore, excuse me. Overall, there's going to be more website news aggregators. And the reason that's important is when we talk about Google News or we talk about Huffington Post as aggregators, we talk about sources for where information can be found. And what that means is that often these sources are not the original creators of the news. We have to think about who creates the news quite differently, because where we get our news or where researchers might obtain news is not necessarily going to be from the original news creator. In addition, another impact that's going to affect all of this is the paywalls are going to go up, and they're going to go up higher and higher as we move through. So that is going to impact not only our ability to provide news content and text to our researchers and students, but it's also going to affect their ability to do that. The single most common question I get is, do you have access so I can get to the New York Times website? Okay, they cannot understand, as you know, why we can't do that. And that will affect how much we can text mine and so on. A couple of last things are that we need to begin to realize that, and this is related, copyright and licensing restrictions are also going to impact what our crawlers and robots can go through. Pamela mentioned that they're asking human rights organizations whether they can go on and crawl their website and take images. If you were to ask a number of news organizations that, you'd get a flat no. So those are going to also affect what information we have. And finally, we need to realize that online databases, our aggregators, are increasingly serving as our archive for news. We personally, we as libraries, do not own most of the content that is in most of the databases that we subscribe to. So I do want to then just talk a little bit about the newspaper and to reinforce the concept of the newspaper as something that is studied and researched. I do this because we'll see that there are common elements that we'll go through when we're actually talking about born digital content. So just as a point, the newspaper has always fascinated people. People have always been fascinated by the newspaper, what it does, what its role is. And so researchers have studied its role, and as we'll see here, how it changed people's understanding of political and cultural events. They're interested in typeface, they're interested in page layout and how that has changed. When USA Today came on, people were very fascinated with the difference in the look and feel of a newspaper like that. So the whole newspaper as a whole is studied in many different ways, studying many different research questions. Newspaper people are also fascinated by what the impact of the newspaper has on the political process, the economics, on stock market prices. So there's also that kind of study. There's also interest in specific parts of the newspaper, editorials. Don't know if any of you realize this is the third year in a row that there's been no Pulitzer for editorial writing. Why is that? But that'll be a study, I'm sure, at some point. But it used to be a worthy Pulitzer Prize, editorial writing. Obituaries, obviously. In other country newspapers, you might have wedding announcements or wedding invitations or things like that that wouldn't be as common here. We've already heard about content analysis in terms of what's going on at George Mason, and content analysis and the framing of news stories is very much an ongoing interest to researchers. If a story is framed in one way versus another, how does that then influence public opinion and so on? Research is done in all the disciplines. I did some quick searching in a number of different disciplinary databases, and I found research in engineering, in the humanities, in social science disciplines, in medicine related to newspapers, and all of those disciplines. So the newspaper is studied by a lot of different sources. I haven't mentioned also that the visual elements are also of a great deal of interest. So let's now finally talk about born digital content. We need to realize that some of the same approaches or questions or methods or what we're trying to do are done with born digital content. We do need to realize that the wealth of text, data, on the internet for born digital news content is enormous. Some researchers have estimated or guesstimated, I guess you have to say, that we are now generating in one day the amount of content that was generated from the beginning of civilization up to 2003. So huge amounts of content, information on the web, of which news content is a piece of that. And another piece of that, within that, is all of the social media, blogging, Facebook, things that we are creating ourselves, not just just these news organizations that we would normally think of. So text mining with news content seems like an obvious thing. What else could we do? And it's not surprising that Business Week's, Time Magazine's Business Week section recently called text mining the next big thing. So let's see if we can look at some of these things, and let's see if everything will work here. I picked 4 or 5 projects that I thought show you visually. I obviously wanted to do something visual here for you. I do want to emphasize that text mining is as technical as mathematical formulas, and I didn't want to show you a bunch of articles showing mathematical formulas. But these are some interesting projects that I've found. They're visually interesting, but there are many other uses of text mining. This project here was actually created by, at the University of California, San Diego. This professor has a number of, has this class in which he's looking at big data and its impact on culture and society. And he had a student who, take a minute here, but she was interested in taking all of the front pages. Now this comes from over 6,000 front pages of a newspaper that are on the Library of Congress Chronicling America website. This is a new way of visualizing the front page, how students, hearkening back to that idea where before you would have to sit and lay out this, look at it on microfilm, you can actually see very quickly how the front page in that time period from 1893 to 1912 has changed over time. It becomes more visual, but notice that layout, headlines, and so on, the masthead all stay in the same place. Now this one you may have already seen. How many of you know about NewsMap? Oops, hang on. There's a delay here. You're wishing that right now. Okay, let's try it this way. Okay, how many of you know about NewsMap? I asked that question and look down. Well, NewsMap is taking, actually, I use this a lot in classes because I think it's a great visualization of news. Now what they're doing is instead of taking the front pages that were digitized from the Library of Congress website, they're taking a totally different approach, and they're taking their data from Google News. Now if you look at Google News, I don't look at Google News very often, but it's arranged by the top stories at the top. It's a little visual, it's a little chaotic, very chaotic. There's some time arrangements, there's some broad subject categories, sports, etc. So what they did was they took those broad categories. They then apply an algorithm or an application to it that gives how many stories from all the news sources that are in Google News and give it a weight. And so that then allows you to see what's the biggest story. So The example in my slideshow was yesterday about this time, and today, and it was, if you saw, it was a story about Mitt Romney, and today it's about global markets and stocks. Now you can actually, if you want to see, this is taking the world as a whole. This is taking, say, if you wanted to look at UK, and you'll almost always find that football, soccer is always the top story in the UK. So you can allow students to, you can yourself see how stories, the weight and the coverage of stories is quite different, the angle of the stories, because they create the headlines based on the stories that they pull off of Google News. So Google News as a news aggregator is being used for this kind of story, this kind of text mining, if you want to call it that. Let's see if I can get back to the right one here. I do not understand why it goes up when I say down. I do know how to use PowerPoint. Let's try it this way. What am I doing wrong? Should I try this one? Okay. This one, which I like very much, is also, maybe some of you have seen this as well, is a very interesting, again, another student project. This one is at Stanford University. And this center, I want to make sure I get their name correct because I think it's important, is a center that is focused on the American West. And what they're trying to do is create visual stories that make stories visually that would typically not be covered by the media. And they believe that they're using visual approaches in order to try and get more attention to low-covered issues related to the West. This particular project was focused on, was a joint project with a journalism professor, a visiting scholar, and he, with his students, developed this, you can read all about it here on their website. And again, here they're using the Library of Congress's Chronicling America website, and they take all the, but they don't use the actual newspaper website, the newspapers on that website. They use another piece of that website, which is the directory of newspapers published in the United States, which is a great tool for us in helping students and faculty locate newspapers. And so they take the directory and they've coded this so that you can actually watch the development of the first newspaper in 1706 to, if you jump along here, westward movement of the press, 1828. 1886, you begin to see a very different picture. And this is just plotting the size of the circle, obviously, depends on, shows how many newspapers are in that area. And if you take this further, you'll actually see newspapers begin to decline. If you do this very quickly through this, you'll see that it grows and then it recedes. Now, that allows students and researchers to see a different idea of how the media affected or were influenced, or the newspaper followed. It'd be interesting to then take, railroads across and highways across and all of those kinds of things and see the relationship between them. So, this is the next kind of a different, instead of it being, it's visual in a different sense, it's more like some of the ones we saw earlier. And this is taking an algorithm called swarm, and don't ask me for the details of what a swarm algorithm is, but what this researcher did was he took this ABC, which is a magazine, a news magazine in Spain, and he took an article that was about political corruption and political parties that he found very interesting, and he entered all of the words in that particular story into his programming and ran this algorithm. And what he noticed, there's several different clusters here, But the one he talks about a little bit is this cluster C, which are words related to friends and relationships, and those words don't seem to be too much involved with political corruption and political parties. So what his argument is that if newspapers themselves in this environment nowadays would take this sort of approach to their stories, they would be able to map related blogs, words being used in these blogs, and allow people to see a visual map of how a story is being used in its relationships to blogs and other informal networks, and that this would be a more useful way for newspapers to place themselves within the news media. This one you might have also seen. This is a great story. This is Mubarak's shutting down of the internet as things were getting a little testy in that country. He closed it down. You can see clearly when he closed it down, but each line is an individual, and what this researcher is able to see is that there are some people who are actually still able to tweet, I think I said blogs. He actually takes the hashtags, specific hashtags of tweets, this is based on tweeting, and sees how you can see where it's shut down when it opens up very clearly. You can see how tweeting by other individuals in other countries increases as a result of this. So this shows you that his question is, did Mubarak really actually shut down the internet? So it's a way of taking tweeting, and we know in some cases that tweets are some of our first news nowadays about the world, and so they're just as much a form of news to be studied by researchers as the traditional forms. Now this last one, this one is a project I became aware of. It's at Penn. There is a team of working on this overall project at Penn State in the political science department, and the MIDS data set has been researchers, mostly in political science, and located teams around the world, have been working for almost 20 years to try and develop a data set that documents every militarized dispute that has taken place going clear back to the beginning of time. Now, that gets more and more complicated, and so they use a lot of sources to try and document where military disputes started, when they ended, and so on. So they have this huge database, and they use, at Penn State, they use LexisNexis to keep the database up to date. They're constantly searching LexisNexis with a set of keywords that they've come up with that are designed, and they've been concerned recently because the results of those canned searches that they've been doing for a number of years haven't been at the levels that they know in finding the kind of content that they want. So this map is based on another piece of the MIDS database. It's called MIDS Lock. And MIDS Lock takes all of those militarized incidents and puts in geographic coordinates for each one of them, so that you can actually, if you plot those, you can see over time where the most militarized incidences have taken place over time. So there's 2 points from this. One is that you can take geographical data. You use newspapers to find the reporting of the beginnings of incidences, and you try and code this. You use graduate students and whatever to code it. But if the content being put into databases like LexisNexis or Factiva is changing in some way, that can also change what they're able to find. So those are some examples of text mining with news content. I tried to pick some that used tweets, commercial databases, a variety of different sources. And as I was preparing for this presentation, I came across this report that just came out a couple of weeks ago from the UK, and it's really talking about, the title is Value and Benefits of Text Mining, and even though it comes out from the UK, I thought it makes a nice summary of what the issues are in relation to text mining in general, and of course we can apply all of these to using text mining with news content. The issues are going to be whether the news content will be openly available. And one of the reasons I emphasize that paywalls are going up and the copyright restrictions are going up is that more and more news content, except tweets possibly and blogging and those kinds of things, The more commercial things, the more things coming out from news organizations are increasingly not going to be open access. They do make a point in this report of talking about how text mining does fit into the scholarly communication mode. It's something that our researchers will be doing. It fits in, it's a scholarly methodology nowadays, and the universities and I would say libraries can provide the same kinds of support. Repositories are going to be necessary to store and retain large amounts of data. We heard that at George Mason, where they're downloading lots of content, but where is that going to be stored? And we've also heard references to whether people, other organizations, news organizations, see preservation in the same way that we do. And maybe we don't want them to, but somebody needs to be preserving this. We've already talked about copyright and licensing issues or curation challenges. They do make a point in this report that text mining is very broad, cross-disciplinary. Nearly every discipline has some interest and use for text mining. And I would say that the role of they also make the point that it's the role of the academy in furthering this research at this point. So some final thoughts that I have for you. Let me catch up with my notes here. Digital forms of news do enhance and facilitate research. And most researchers would prefer to look at digital content online or to search it online. I do have some faculty who very much want to look at it on microfilm, but they're doing a particular kind of research, so that's why they are interested in that. Or the content that they're looking at has not been digitized. We are seeing that you can create new forms of research based on news content with digital content, but we also see continuing patterns of looking at page form, looking at content analysis, that some of these themes will continue and types of research will continue even though we're dealing with digital content. And we see that, we've heard this again, that digital content and text mining and whatever will attract cross-disciplinary, many disciplines will be interested in this kind of opportunity. And I haven't made this point as well as I should, but I always see text mining as, I see more and more references to international, comparisons of international or other countries' news, so the ABC News magazine, or comparisons of Al Jazeera in US. So you'll see, I think that digital content makes it easier for people to do comparisons or study news from other countries. I quickly want to make the point that we really should not, I don't know if this is too strong a word for it, but we do have to be aware that there are still huge swaths of news content that is not digitized or available in any type of digital form. In the United States alone, 140,000 newspapers were published, have been published, and only 800 of those have been digitized on the Chronicling America website. So we really have digitized a fraction of the total historical content. And from 1923 to 1985, that's my most, I cringe when I get a question in that time period because I have to say I'm sorry. That's, that's the bottom. There's nothing, rarely, except, unusual situations. So microfilm is their only option. I use the beginning of 85, but that's about when, for major newspapers, we get the use of online databases and content begins there. So most libraries will have some microfilm and they'll have some commercial online database access. And then we fall back down again, and when about, you'd call 2000, about the beginning of this digital wealth of digital news content, in which some of that, but most of it is not in any digital form except what's out on the web. So we have to think about what we will have for our researchers in even 5 or 6 years to offer them. So I do want to just end very quickly with what do researchers need when they think about digital content. They need access to a variety of news sources. It's true, you can never guess what next researchers, which newspaper or news source they're going to ask you for. So we need a broad swath of content from a wide range of countries available in digital format. We need both new and old forms. So there are still people studying the old the newspaper. Okay, they still want the newspaper, but there are increasingly students who want to study blogs. They want to study what a website did. They want to study those kinds of things, but with newer news forms. They want flexible functionality in terms of finding and searching and looking at the content. So while one researcher with the very same newspaper wants to turn the pages and carefully and study the content, what they're looking for can't be searched for, the next researcher doesn't care anything about that page format and wants to search it. Both researchers need to be accommodated in whatever we create. We also need, and this is reliability and quality of information, so that researchers need to know that whatever they're searching in the LexisNexis database or on a website or a web search engine is the same content from year to year. And with news content changing so much lately, that is becoming increasingly in question. And they need to know that the quality of both the reproduction, the OCRing, and all of that is part of what they're searching. Ease of access, you all know that researchers need to be able to get to things easily and quickly, okay, and tell their students how to do it. And they need good search engines that allow for very sophisticated relationships of words, but also the ability to search specific sub-content of news content. I want to search just advertisement. I want to search just photographs. I want to search just birth records. I want to just search classified ads. Those are very important functionality for most researchers. So in the end, I just want to say I hope that as we look at news content in relation to news content, we won't simply say we're moving forward, but we also have to look, unfortunately, at a wide range of content and resources and continue to know that our researchers will need all of this content today, tomorrow, and into the future. Thank you very much.